The desert air at Camp Roberts shimmered like broken glass in the early morning heat, and Ashley Martinez knew she was being watched. Not the casual glances soldiers gave each other during morning chow or equipment checks, but the deliberate, measuring stare of someone deciding whether you belonged. Commander Blake Garrison stood 30 feet away, his weathered hands wrapped around a cup of black coffee that had probably gone cold an hour ago. His eyes never left the Barrett .50 caliber rifle lying on the maintenance table beside the supply tent. More importantly, they never left Ashley as she walked past it on her way to the medical station. The warning had come 3 days earlier, delivered so quietly it might have been about a broken radio instead of the most powerful sniper rifle in their arsenal. Ashley had been restocking medical supplies when Garrison approached, his boots making no sound on the sand-covered plywood flooring of the makeshift clinic. "Martinez," he said, his voice carrying that particular tone commanders used when they wanted something understood without debate. "See that Barrett over there?" Ashley glanced toward the rifle, its dark metal gleaming despite the dust that seemed to coat everything else in camp. She nodded. "If you touch that weapon, you're off this team permanently. No discussion, no second chances. You're a medic, not a marksman. Stay in your lane." The words hung in the desert air like heat waves. Ashley felt something cold settle in her stomach, not fear exactly, but recognition. She'd heard variations of this speech before, at medical training in 29 Palms, during her first assignment at Pendleton. Always the same message. Know your place. Stay small. Don't reach beyond what others think you can handle. "If I—" "Understood, sir," she replied, her voice steady despite the way her pulse had quickened. Garrison studied her face for a long moment, as if searching for signs of defiance or argument. When he found neither, he nodded once and walked away, leaving Ashley alone with the sudden realization that she was being tested in ways she hadn't expected. Now, 3 days later, the Barrett seemed to call to her every time she passed it. Not because she wanted to disobey orders, but because something about the weapon felt familiar in a way that made her chest tight with memories she'd been trying to forget. Ashley Martinez hadn't grown up planning to be a Navy medic. In the dusty suburbs outside 29 Palms, she'd been the daughter of a Marine Corps instructor who could field strip an M16 in complete darkness, and a librarian mother who believed books could solve any problem the world threw at you. Her father, Roberto Martinez, had been a Marine sniper before transitioning to training roles, and their garage had always smelled like gun oil and possibility. But that was before the accident. Before the training exercise that went wrong and left her father's funeral flag folded in a triangle on their mantelpiece. Before her mother's quiet plea, "Promise me, Mia, no more guns. There's been enough death in this family." Ashley had promised, and she'd kept that promise. She'd chosen medicine over marksmanship, healing over hunting. She'd buried her father's lessons about breath control and wind, calculation under layers of anatomy textbooks and trauma protocols. For 4 years, she'd been the perfect military medic, competent, quiet, and completely unthreatening to anyone who might question whether women belonged on the front lines. But promises made in grief sometimes crack under pressure, and Ashley could feel hairline fractures spreading through hers every time she looked at that rifle. The team respected her medical skills, but respect had boundaries. During mission briefings, she was often the only voice not heard. When she suggested modifications to their medical evacuation procedures based on desert conditions she'd studied extensively, Staff Sergeant Tony Morrison had waved her off with barely concealed annoyance. "Stick to bandages and morphine, Doc," he'd said, using the nickname that was meant to be affectionate but felt diminishing. "Let us handle the tactical stuff." When she'd asked to observe sniper training to better understand how to treat long-range combat injuries, the request had been met with barely controlled laughter from several team members. Even Garrison had seemed amused, his mouth quirking up at one corner before he shook his head. "You're overthinking this, Martinez. Your job is to patch people up after we do our job. Different skill sets." The dismissal stung, but they also revealed something Ashley had started to suspect. Her teammates saw her as an accessory to their mission rather than an integral part of it. She was useful when someone got hurt, invisible when strategy was discussed, and apparently threatening enough to warrant warnings about which equipment she was allowed to touch. But late at night, when the camp settled into the tense quiet of soldiers trying to sleep before another day of training that might become real combat without warning, Ashley found herself thinking about wind speed and bullet trajectory. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, patient and precise. "The rifle doesn't make the shooter, Mia. The shooter makes the rifle. But first, you have to know yourself well enough to know when to pull the trigger and when to walk away." The Barrett lay 20 feet from her bunk, close enough that she could see its outline in the darkness. Close enough that she could almost feel the weight of it, the balance her father had taught her to appreciate in weapons that were tools first and symbols second. Close enough to remind her that some promises were harder to keep than others when the people around you assumed you were too weak to break them. As Ashley finally drifted towards sleep, she wondered what Commander Garrison would do if he knew that the medic he'd just warned away from his precious rifle could probably outshoot half the men in his unit. She wondered what he'd say if he knew that every time she looked at that Barrett, she wasn't seeing a weapon she wanted to steal. She was seeing a test she wasn't sure she wanted to pass. Tomorrow would bring another day of staying in her assigned lane, another day of being useful but underestimated. But deep in her chest, something was stirring that felt dangerously like her father's stubborn pride, and Ashley wasn't entirely sure she could keep it buried much longer. The desert wind howled softly outside the tent walls, carrying with it the sound of distant helicopter rotors and the promise of missions that would test everyone's limits. Ashley closed her eyes and tried not to think about what would happen when those limits finally broke. The trouble started with a simple request that should have been routine. Ashley had been reviewing the team's medical protocols when she noticed a glaring problem. Their current trauma kits were designed for urban warfare, not desert conditions. The hemostatic agents would lose effectiveness in extreme heat. The 4 fluids could crystallize, and the pain medications had shortened shelf lives in temperatures that regularly exceeded 100 degrees. She'd spent 3 weeks researching alternatives, cross-referencing military medical journals with field reports from other desert deployments. Her recommendations were thorough, evidence-based, and could potentially save lives. When she finally requested a meeting with Commander Garrison, she thought she was doing her job. She was wrong. "Martinez, what's this about?" Garrison asked when she entered his office, a converted shipping container that somehow managed to be both cramped and intimidating. He didn't look up from the tactical map spread across his desk. "Sir, I've identified some critical issues with our current medical supplies for desert operations. I have recommendations for—" "Stop right there." Garrison's voice cut through her explanation like a blade. He finally looked up, his gray eyes cold and dismissive. "Who asked you to do this research?" The question caught Ashley off guard. "Sir, I thought it was important too. I didn't ask what you thought was important. I asked who gave you orders to second-guess our equipment specifications." Ashley felt heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the desert sun. "No one gave me orders, sir. I was being proactive about proactive." Garrison repeated the word like it tasted bitter. "Let me explain something to you, Martinez. This team has been operating successfully for 3 years. Our medical protocols were designed by people with more experience than you've had time to accumulate. Your job is to follow those protocols, not redesign them. But sir, the data clearly shows. The data Garrison stood up, his chair scraping against the container floor. You want to talk about data? Here's some data for you. I have a medic who's spending her time playing researcher instead of maintaining readiness. I have someone who thinks 4 years of medical training makes her smarter than the entire military medical command. That's not the kind of data I find reassuring. Ashley's hands clenched at her sides. Everything her father had taught her about military respect warred with the injustice of being dismissed without even being heard. Sir, with respect, I'm not questioning the command structure. I'm trying to ensure our team has the best possible medical support. No, Martinez, you're overstepping. And here's what's going to happen. Garrison walked around his desk, stopping uncomfortably close to where Ashley stood at attention. You're going to take these recommendations of yours and file them away. You're going to focus on your assigned duties. And you're going to remember that medical decisions for this team come from people who outrank you by several pay grades. The dismissal felt like a physical blow. Ashley had prepared for disagreement, even skepticism, but not for complete disregard. Sir, what if someone gets hurt because my medic is more interested in playing scientist than staying prepared for actual medical emergencies? Garrison's voice dropped to a dangerous quiet. What if I can't trust my medical officer to follow orders because she's too busy thinking she knows better than everyone else? The words hung in the air like a threat. Ashley realized with growing dismay that this wasn't about medical protocols at all. This was about something much more fundamental, her place in the hierarchy, and Garrison's determination to keep her in it. I understand, sir, she said finally, her voice steady despite the anger building in her chest. Good. Dismissed. Ashley saluted and turned to leave, but Garrison's voice stopped her at the door. And Martinez? That Barrett rifle isn't the only thing on this base you're not qualified to touch. Remember that. Outside the container, Ashley stood in the blazing sun and tried to process what had just happened. She'd been slapped down not for being wrong, but for being right in a way that threatened someone's sense of control. Her research was solid, her recommendations were sound, but none of that mattered because she'd forgotten the unwritten rule. Women in combat roles were supposed to be grateful for inclusion, not assertive about improvement. Staff Sergeant Morrison appeared beside her, apparently emerging from a nearby equipment tent. Rough meeting? He asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Something like that, Ashley replied, not trusting herself to say more. Morrison studied her face for a moment, then glanced back toward Garrison's office. Word of advice, Doc? The commander doesn't like surprises. He especially doesn't like being told his systems need fixing by someone who hasn't been downrange with us yet. Those systems could get people killed, Ashley said quietly. Maybe, but challenging the commander publicly? That'll definitely get you transferred out. Is that what you want? Ashley looked at Morrison's weathered face and saw something that might have been sympathy, but was definitely a warning. She was being told, again, to stay in her lane. To accept that being included meant accepting limitations on how included she could actually be. No, she said finally. That's not what I want. Good. Then let it go, Doc. There'll be other battles. But, as Morrison walked away, Ashley wondered if there would be other battles, or if she just learned that fighting for anything meaningful would always be seen as insubordination. The Barrett rifle gleamed in the distance, and she found herself thinking about her father's lessons on picking your battles carefully. She'd just lost her first real engagement with the team's power structure, but something told her the war was far from over. That evening, as Ashley sat alone in the medical tent updating equipment logs, she made a decision that would have consequences she couldn't yet imagine. She pulled out a notebook and began documenting everything. Garrison's dismissal of her, researched the specific medical vulnerabilities she'd identified, and the exact wording of his threats. if the day came when someone got hurt because of inadequate medical protocols, she wanted a record of the conversation that could have prevented it. She wasn't planning a rebellion, but she was no longer planning to stay silent either. The desert night was unusually quiet, and in that silence, Ashley began to understand that respect in this environment wouldn't be given freely. It would have to be earned in ways she'd never anticipated. Through tests she wasn't sure she was ready to face. But ready or not, those tests were coming. 3 weeks after the medical protocol incident, Ashley learned that Commander Garrison's warnings came. With enforcement mechanisms she hadn't anticipated, it started small, the way most targeted harassment does. Her duty roster suddenly included the least desirable shifts, equipment maintenance during the hottest part of the day, overnight medical readiness during training exercises that never materialized, inventory counts that seemed to require recounting. When she finished tasks efficiently, she was assigned additional duties that kept her busy, but contributed little to the team's actual mission readiness. The message was clear: stay busy, stay quiet, stay in your place. But it was the conversation she overheard between Garrison and Morrison that revealed the true scope of her problem. Ashley had been restocking medical supplies in the storage container adjacent to the command tent when their voices carried through the thin metal walls. She hadn't intended to eavesdrop, but when she heard her name, she found herself frozen in place. "Martinez is becoming a problem," Garrison was saying, his tone matter-of-fact. "She's got ideas above her station." "She's a good medic," Morrison replied carefully. "The team trusts her. The team trusts her to do medical work. They don't need her second-guessing our operational decisions or thinking she's qualified for roles she's not trained for." Ashley's hands tightened around the supply box she'd been organizing. What roles was he talking about? "What do you want me to do about it?" Morrison asked. "Keep her busy. Make sure she doesn't have time to work on any more improvement projects, and watch her around the weapons. She's been spending too much time near the Barrett." Ashley's blood went cold. She hadn't been anywhere near the Barrett except when passing it during normal duties, but apparently even that was being monitored and misinterpreted. "You think she's planning something?" Morrison sounded skeptical. "I think she's the type who believes her own hype. 4 years of medical training, and she thinks she's qualified to redesign our entire operation. Next thing you know, she'd be claiming she can handle combat roles." The bitter laugh that followed made Ashley's stomach clench. She was being painted as delusional, as someone whose competence in one area had made her overconfident about others. The fact that she actually did have extensive weapons training was irrelevant. What mattered was that she was being systematically undermined and isolated. "I'll keep an eye on her," Morrison said finally. "Good. And if she steps out of line again, document it. I want a paper trail if we need to transfer her out." Ashley remained motionless until she heard them leave, then carefully finished her inventory with hands that trembled slightly. She just learned that her position on the team was more precarious than she'd realized, and that Garrison was actively building a case against her. But she'd also learned something else. He was worried about her, worried enough to have Morrison watching her, worried enough to monitor her movements around weapons, worried enough to want her transferred rather than risk whatever he thought she might do. The question was, what exactly was he afraid of? The answer came 2 days later during a combined training exercise that was supposed to test the team's coordination under stress. Ashley had been assigned to the medical station, a safe distance from the actual combat simulation where she was expected to wait for casualties that might or might not materialize. She watched through binoculars as the team moved through a mock urban environment, clearing buildings and neutralizing targets. Everything went smoothly until the simulated ambush. The scenario called for enemy contact from an elevated position. That would pin down the assault team until the sniper could neutralize the threat. But something went wrong with the simulation. The designated sniper, Corporal Jake Williams, was dealing with a malfunctioning rifle scope, and the assault team was stuck in the open, taking simulated fire from multiple directions. Ashley could see the problem immediately. There was a clear shot from a position about 300 yards to her left, an angle that would eliminate the simulated threat and allow the exercise to continue. Williams was trying to fix his scope, but even from her distance, Ashley could tell it was a hardware problem that would take time to resolve. The exercise ground to a halt as instructors debated whether to reset the scenario or call it a failure. Ashley watched Williams struggle with his equipment and felt something familiar stirring in her chest. The desire to solve a problem that was right in front of her dot without fully realizing what she was doing. Ashley found herself walking toward the spare Barrett that had been set up as backup equipment for the exercise. Her hands moved automatically, checking the scope alignment and sight picture the way her father had taught her years ago. The rifle felt familiar in her hands, balanced and purposeful. She was lining up to shot when a voice cut through the desert air like a whip crack. "Martinez, step away from that weapon." Garrison's voice carried across the exercise area, loud enough that everyone involved in the simulation stopped what they were doing to look. Ashley found herself frozen, the Barrett still in her hands, with every eye on the training ground focused on her. She carefully set the rifle down and stepped back, her face burning with humiliation. The walk back to the medical station felt like a mile, with Garrison's angry footsteps pounding the sand behind her. "What the hell did you think you were doing?" he demanded when they were out of earshot of the other team members. "The exercise was stalled. I could see a solution." "You could see a solution? To a tactical problem? With a weapon you're not qualified to use?" Garrison's voice rose with each question. "Do you have any idea how that looked? My medic grabbing a sniper rifle because she thinks she knows better than my designated marksman." Ashley felt her composure cracking. "I was trying to help. The scenario is not your responsibility. Your responsibility is medical support, period. But apparently, that's not enough for you, is it? You want to be the tactical genius, the weapons expert, the person who saves the day?" The accusation stung because it contained just enough truth to be devastating. Ashley did want to contribute more than she was being allowed to. She did think she could help solve problems that weren't strictly medical. And yes, part of her did want to prove that she was more capable than anyone gave her credit for. "I'm sorry, sir," she said quietly. "Sorry doesn't fix the damage you just did to team cohesion. Sorry doesn't undo the fact that my medic just demonstrated that she thinks military roles are interchangeable." Garrison stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to stay away from all weapons during training. You're going to focus exclusively on medical duties. And if I see you anywhere near combat equipment again, you'll be on the next transport back to base for reassignment. Do I make myself clear?" "Crystal clear, sir." But as Garrison walked away, Ashley realized that something fundamental had shifted. She'd been publicly humiliated, professionally threatened, and personally diminished. More importantly, she'd been told in front of the entire team that her judgment was suspect and her ambitions were inappropriate. The problem was, she'd also gotten a perfect sight picture on that target. Her hands had been steady, her breathing controlled, and she'd known with complete certainty that she could have made the shot. That knowledge sat in her chest like a burning coal, impossible to ignore and dangerous to acknowledge. Later that evening, Corporal Williams approached her at the medical tent. He was a quiet man in his late 20s, competent but not exceptional, and one of the few team members who'd never treated her dismissively. "Hey, Doc," he said, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. "About today, ... "I'm sorry. Your equipment malfunctioned," Ashley said quickly. "I wasn't trying to I know what you were trying to do," Williams interrupted. "And for what it's worth, you were right about the shot angle. I've been looking at the same position." Ashley studied his face, searching for signs that this was some kind of test or trap. "It doesn't matter now. Maybe not. But I've been thinking about what you said a few weeks ago about medical modifications for desert conditions." I looked into it after hours. Williams pulled a folded paper from his pocket. "You were right about that too. The current trauma kits have temperature stability issues." He handed her the paper, a printout of military medical research that supported every recommendation she'd made to Garrison. Ashley felt a mixture of vindication and frustration. The information had been available all along. Her research had been solid. But none of that mattered if the person in charge refused to listen. "Why are you showing me this?" she asked. Williams shrugged. "Because being right shouldn't be a career-ending offense. And because good ideas don't get less good just because they come from people other folks underestimate." After he left, Ashley sat alone in the medical tent and tried to process the day's events. She'd been humiliated and threatened, but she'd also learned that at least one team member respected her judgment. She'd been told to stay in her lane, but she'd also discovered that her instincts about both medical protocols and tactical situations were sound. Most importantly, she'd learned that Commander Garrison's efforts to diminish her were having an unintended consequence. They were making her more determined to prove him wrong. The Barrett rifle sat in its case 30 yards away, as forbidden and tempting as ever. Ashley looked at it through the tent flap and wondered what would happen when the next crisis came. Because despite all the warnings and threats, she was beginning to suspect the crisis was exactly what it would take to reveal who she really was beneath the medic's uniform. The question was whether she'd be brave enough or foolish enough to show them when that moment arrived. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning that started like any other and ended with Ashley questioning everything she thought she knew about military loyalty. The team was preparing for a live-fire exercise in the mountain terrain east of camp when Private Lucas Torres, the youngest member of their unit, approached Ashley at the medical station. He was 19, fresh out of training, and had the kind of nervous energy that reminded Ashley of herself when she'd first arrived. "Doc, can I ask you something?" Torres glanced around to make sure they were alone. "It's about the medical gear." Ashley looked up from the trauma kit she'd been inspecting. "What about it?" "Well, yesterday, during the Desert Nav exercise, Rodriguez got heat exhaustion. Real bad. And when I went to get the 4 fluids..." Torres hesitated, then pulled a plastic bag from his pocket. "They look like this." Ashley examined the 4 bag and felt her stomach drop. The fluid had crystallized, exactly as she'd predicted in her research. The bag was completely unusable, potentially dangerous if administered. She checked the lot numbers and realized this was from the same batch she'd identified as problematic in her report to Garrison. "Where did you find this?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "In the standard medical kit." "Doc, there were 3 more just like it. If Rodriguez had been more serious, if we'd needed to start on 4 in the field..." Torres didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. Ashley stared at the crystallized 4 bag and felt something cold and sharp settle in her chest. Her research had been dismissed, her recommendations ignored, and now they were carrying medical supplies that could fail when lives were on the line. She'd tried to prevent this exact scenario, and she'd been told to stay in her lane. "Torres, I need you to check all the medical kits. Document everything that looks questionable. Pictures, lot numbers, expiration dates. Can you do that quietly?" "Yes, ma'am." "But Doc... Torres looked uncomfortable. "What are we going to do about it?" Ashley looked at the useless 4 bag in her hands and realized she was facing a choice that would define the rest of her military career. She could document the problems quietly and wait for someone to get seriously hurt, Or she could force the issue and risk everything she'd worked for. "Let me handle that part," she said finally. 2 hours later, Ashley knocked on the door of Commander Garrison's office, carrying a medical kit that contained 6 pieces of compromised equipment. She'd rehearsed this conversation a dozen times, trying to find an approach that would get results without triggering Garrison's defensiveness. She failed. "Sir, we have a critical medical supply problem," she began, setting the kit on his desk. "During yesterday's exercise, we discovered that several items have been compromised by heat exposure." Garrison barely glanced at the kit. Define compromised. Ashley opened the kit and showed him the crystallized 4 fluids, the separation in, the hemostatic agents, and the discolored pain medications. These supplies could fail in a medical emergency. They're potentially dangerous to administer. "According to who?" The question caught Ashley off guard. "Sir, the evidence is right here. These supplies are visibly degraded. The evidence, according to you. The same medic who's been trying to redesign our medical protocols since the day she arrived." Garrison leaned back in his chair, his expression skeptical. "How do I know you didn't tamper with these supplies to prove your point?" Ashley felt the accusation hit her like a physical blow. "Sir, I would never compromise medical equipment. This degradation is caused by heat exposure, exactly as I predicted in my original report. Your original report that was based on theoretical research, not field experience." Garrison stood up, walking around his desk. "Martinez, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I want a direct answer. Did you intentionally expose these supplies to heat to create this evidence?" The world seemed to stop. Ashley stared at Garrison's face and realized he was serious. He was actually accusing her of sabotaging medical equipment to win an argument. The accusation was so outrageous, so fundamentally opposed to everything she stood for as a medic, that for a moment she couldn't speak. "No, sir," she said finally, her voice barely controlled. "I could not tamper with medical supplies. But you admit you've been looking for problems with our current protocols. I'd been trying to ensure our medical readiness. Or you've been trying to prove you were right and I was wrong." Garrison's voice hardened. "Here's what I think happened, Martinez. I think you've been so invested in your theories about desert medical protocols that you've lost sight of your actual responsibilities. I think you're more interested in being right than being helpful." Ashley felt something break inside her chest. Not just disappointment or frustration, but something deeper and more fundamental. The realization that no amount of evidence, no degree of professional competence, no level of dedication would matter if the person in charge had already decided she was the problem. "Sir, what if someone gets seriously hurt because our medical supplies fail? What if someone gets seriously hurt because my medic is more focused on proving points than maintaining readiness?" Garrison walked back to his desk and sat down, dismissing her with his body language. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to requisition new medical supplies according to standard protocols. You're going to stop looking for problems that don't exist. And you're going to remember that your job is to support this team, not undermine its leadership." Ashley stood there holding a bag of crystallized 4 fluid that could kill someone if used in an emergency, listening to her commander tell her that preventing medical failures was somehow undermining leadership. She thought about Private Torres, trusting her to handle this situation. She thought about Rodriguez, who'd gotten lucky that his heat exhaustion hadn't been more serious. She thought about every future mission where compromised medical supplies could turn a survivable injury into a casualty. "I understand, sir," she said quietly. "Good." Dismissed. Ashley saluted and left the office, but instead of feeling defeated, she felt something she hadn't experienced since her father's death: absolute clarity about what needed to happen next. That evening, she sat in her bunk and wrote 2 documents. The first was a formal report documenting the medical supply failures, complete with photographs, lot numbers, and technical specifications. The second was a letter to the base medical officer, requesting an independent review of medical protocols. For desert operations, she wasn't going around Garrison to cause trouble. She was going around him to save lives. As she sealed both documents in separate envelopes, Ashley thought about her father's advice about picking battles. He'd also taught her that some battles pick you, and when they do, the only choice is whether to fight with honor or surrender with regret. She tried surrender. Tomorrow, she'd try honor. The Barrett rifle sat in its case across the compound, as distant and forbidden as ever. But for the first time since arriving at camp, Ashley wasn't thinking about the rifle as something she was forbidden to touch. She was thinking about it as something she might need to earn the right to carry. The difference was subtle but significant. Tomorrow would determine which interpretation proved correct. Ashley's letter to the base medical officer arrived at headquarters on a Wednesday morning and created the kind of bureaucratic earthquake that military commanders spend their careers trying to avoid. Dr. Patricia Hayes, the senior medical officer for the Western Training Command, was the kind of career military doctor who'd seen enough preventable injuries to have zero tolerance for medical corner cutting. When she opened Ashley's meticulously documented report about heat-degraded medical supplies, complete with photographs and technical analysis, her response was swift and unforgiving. The phone call to Camp Roberts came at 0800 hours. The next day, Ashley was conducting routine equipment maintenance when Corporal Williams found her at the medical station. His expression carefully neutral, but his eyes holding something that might have been respect. "Doc, you need to report to the commander's office. Now." Ashley's stomach clenched, but she kept her voice steady. "Did he say what about?" "Nope, but there's a staff car in the parking area that wasn't there an hour ago." The walk to Garrison's office felt like walking to an execution, but Ashley kept her spine straight and her breathing controlled. Whatever consequences were coming, she'd earned them by choosing to put patient safety ahead of chain of command politics. She knocked on the door and entered to find Garrison behind his desk, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. Beside him stood a woman in crisp dress blues with silver oak leaves on her collar, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, whose reputation for no-nonsense medical oversight preceded her everywhere she went. "Petty Officer Martinez," Garrison said, his voice dangerously quiet. "I believe you know why you're here." Ashley came to attention. "No, sir? Really? You have no idea why the base medical officer has driven 3 hours to personally inspect our medical protocols?" Ashley glanced at Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, who was studying her with the kind of professional assessment that made Ashley feel like she was being x-rayed. "I submitted a report regarding potential medical supply issues, sir." "You went around your chain of command," Garrison said, his voice rising slightly. "You undermined my authority and wasted the time of senior officers with complaints that had already been addressed." "Actually," Lieutenant Colonel Hayes interjected, her voice cutting through Garrison's anger like a scalpel, "Petty Officer Martinez's report was both professionally written and medically sound. We've completed an independent analysis of the medical supplies she identified, and her concerns were completely justified." The silence that followed was deafening. Ashley watched Garrison's face cycle through several emotions before settling on something that looked like disbelief. "Ma'am, I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding. The only misunderstanding, Commander, is how a medic with 4 years of training was able to identify critical supply failures that apparently escaped the attention of her superiors." Hayes turned to Ashley. "Petty Officer Martinez, your report recommended specific alternative supplies rated for extreme temperature conditions. Where did you source that information?" "Military medical journals, ma'am. Cross-referenced with field reports from other desert deployments. The temperature stability data is available through the Defense Medical Supply Center." And how long ago did you present these findings to your command structure? Ashley glanced at Garrison, whose expression had gone carefully blank. Approximately 6 weeks ago, ma'am. Hayes nodded slowly, then turned back to Garrison. Commander, I'm ordering an immediate replacement of all medical supplies that fall outside of temperature stability parameters. I'm also implementing Petty Officer Martinez's recommendations as standard protocol for all desert operations in this command. Ashley felt something that might have been relief, but was tempered by the realization that she'd just won a battle. That would make the war much more difficult. Furthermore, Hayes continued, I'm recommending Petty Officer Martinez for commendation for professional excellence and initiative in medical readiness. The rest of the meeting passed in a blur of protocol discussions and logistics planning. Ashley answered Hayes's technical questions while trying to ignore the waves of barely controlled anger radiating from Garrison's side of the desk. When Hayes finally departed, Ashley found herself alone with Garrison, waiting for the explosion. She knew it was coming. It didn't come. Instead, Garrison walked to his window and stared out at the training grounds for a long moment before speaking. Congratulations, Martinez. You got what you wanted. Sir, I only wanted to ensure medical readiness. Garrison turned around, and Ashley was surprised to see that his expression wasn't angry anymore. It was calculating. What you wanted was to prove that you're smarter than everyone else in this unit. What you wanted was to make me look incompetent to my superiors. And what you wanted was to establish that the rules don't apply to you when you decide they're inconvenient. Ashley felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Sir, that's not. Let me finish. Garrison's voice was deadly. Quiet. You think you've won something here, but what you've actually done is declare war on the concept of military hierarchy. You've shown every person in this unit that if you disagree with a command decision, you can go around your superiors and get them overruled. Ashley realized with growing alarm that Garrison wasn't backing down. He was escalating. Here's what's going to happen, he continued. You're going to discover that being right about one thing doesn't make you qualified for anything else. You're going to learn that undermining your commander has consequences that extend far beyond medical protocols. And you're going to find out what happens when someone decides that military discipline is optional. The threat was clear, even if the specifics weren't. Ashley had won the medical supply battle, but she'd also painted a target on herself that was going to make the rest of her time with this unit significantly more difficult. I understand, sir, she said quietly. No, Martinez. You really don't, but you will. After she left Garrison's office, Ashley found Williams waiting for her outside the command tent. He fell into step beside her as they walked toward the equipment. Area? So? He asked quietly. So we're getting new medical supplies. Temperature rated for desert conditions. Williams nodded. That's good news. What's the bad news? Ashley glanced back toward the command tent, where she could see Garrison through the window on the phone and gesturing angrily. The bad news is that I just learned the difference between winning a battle and surviving a war. That evening, Ashley sat in her bunk and tried to process what had happened. She'd done the right thing, followed proper procedures for reporting safety concerns, and been vindicated by independent review. By any reasonable measure, she should have felt satisfied. Instead, she felt like she was standing at the edge of a cliff, looking down at a drop she hadn't seen coming. The Barrett rifle sat in its case across the compound, and for the first time since arriving at camp, Ashley found herself wondering not whether she'd ever be allowed to touch it, but whether she'd ever be in a position where touching it would be the difference between survival and catastrophe. Because if today had taught her anything, it was that Commander Garrison wasn't the kind of man who accepted defeat gracefully. And she was no longer the kind of medic who was willing to accept limitations that put lives at risk. The convergence of those two realities was going to be interesting in ways Ashley wasn't sure she was prepared for. The retaliation started subtly, the way most professional revenge does. Ashley's duty assignments suddenly became exercises in creative punishment. She found herself scheduled for back-to-back shifts that technically complied with duty regulations, but left her exhausted and isolated from the rest of the team. Equipment inspections that should have taken an hour stretched to 3 hours when Garrison decided her work needed to be thoroughly reviewed. Her requests for routine medical supplies began requiring additional paperwork and extended approval processes. But it was the conversation she wasn't supposed to hear that revealed the true scope of Garrison's response to her victory with the medical supplies. Ashley had been inventorying the new temperature-rated medical equipment when voices carried from the adjacent planning tent. She recognized Garrison's voice immediately, and the second voice belonged to Major Frank Coleman, the base executive officer who was visiting for the quarterly readiness review. "What's your assessment of the Martinez situation?" Coleman was asking. "She's a problem that's getting worse," Garrison replied without hesitation. The medical supply issue was just the beginning. She's got this idea that her technical knowledge makes her qualified to second-guess command decisions. Ashley's hand stilled on the medical kit she'd been organizing. The base medical officer seemed impressed with her initiative, Coleman observed. The base medical officer saw a competent report about a technical issue. She didn't see the pattern of insubordination that led to it. Garrison's voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. Martinez went around the chain of command because she couldn't accept that her recommendations had been properly considered and rejected. Ashley bit back the urge to laugh bitterly. Her recommendations hadn't been rejected. They'd been dismissed without consideration. "What kind of pattern are we talking about?" Coleman asked. Overconfidence in areas outside her expertise, lack of respect for authority, and most concerning, an apparent belief that military protocols don't apply to her when she disagrees with them. Ashley listened with growing dismay as Garrison painted a picture of her as an insubordinate maverick who posed a threat to unit cohesion. Every incident was reframed. Her medical research became evidence of insubordination. Her questions about training became challenges to authority. Even her competent performance was twisted into proof that she thought she was too good for her. Assigned role. "Have you documented these incidents?" Coleman asked, extensively. "I've been building a case for transfer since her second week here. The medical supply incident was just the final piece of evidence I needed." Ashley felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Garrison hadn't been responding to her actions. He'd been planning her removal from the beginning. The medical supply victory hadn't changed his mind about her. It had simply provided him with the prestige justification he'd been seeking. "What's your recommendation?" Coleman asked. "Transfer her to a rear echelon medical facility, where her technical skills can be useful, but her attitude won't contaminate an operational unit. I've already identified a replacement medic who has better team integration skills." Ashley closed her eyes and tried to process what she'd just learned. She was being systematically removed from a position she'd earned through competence and dedication, not because of any failure on her part, but because she'd had the audacity to be right about something important. "The timing might be problematic," Coleman said thoughtfully. "The medical officer's commendation recommendation is still pending. Transferring Martinez immediately after she identified a legitimate safety issue might raise questions, which is why I'm recommending we wait for the next training cycle. Let some time pass, then process the transfer as a routine personnel decision. No one will question moving a medic to a different assignment after she's completed her current training rotation." Ashley realized with crystalline clarity that she was listening to her professional death sentence being planned. In 6 weeks, when the current training cycle ended, she would be transferred to some rear area medical facility, where her career would quietly stagnate, until she accepted that challenging authority was a luxury she couldn't afford. the conversation shifted to other personnel matters, and Ashley quietly finished her inventory and left the supply tent. But instead of feeling defeated, she found herself thinking about something her father had told her years ago. When someone decides to destroy you, Mia, you have two choices. Let them, or make sure they regret trying. That evening, Ashley sat in her quarters and made a decision that would change everything. She opened her laptop and began documenting every conversation, every retaliatory assignment, every instance of differential treatment she'd experienced since filing her medical report. But more importantly, she began researching military regulations regarding retaliation against personnel who report safety violations. What she found was a legal framework that made Garrison's actions not just unethical, but potentially criminal. The Whistleblower Protection Act, military personnel regulations, and specific provisions in the Manual for Courts-Martial all provided explicit protections for service members who reported legitimate safety concerns through proper channels. Retaliation against such personnel was a violation of federal law, punishable by court-martial and potential criminal prosecution. Ashley had done everything by the book, identified a legitimate safety issue, documented it thoroughly, reported it through appropriate channels, and been vindicated by independent review. Garrison's response wasn't just inappropriate command leadership, it was a federal crime. She spent the next 3 days quietly building her case. She documented every retaliatory action, cross-referenced duty assignments to show the pattern of punitive scheduling, and compiled communications that demonstrated the hostile work environment Garrison had created. But the breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Corporal Williams approached her at the medical station on Friday afternoon, glancing around nervously before speaking. "Doc, can we talk somewhere private?" They walked to the equipment maintenance area, far enough from the command tents to avoid being overheard. "What's going on, Williams?" He pulled out his phone and showed her a voice recording app. "I was in the command tent yesterday when Garrison was briefing the new training schedule. He was talking about you." Ashley's stomach clenched. What did he say? Williams hit play, and Garrison's voice filled the space between them. "Martinez thinks she's untouchable because she got lucky with that medical supply issue. She needs to learn that there are consequences for going around the chain of command. I want her isolated from the team, overworked, and ready to request transfer herself within the month." The recording continued with Garrison giving specific instructions to the team leaders about excluding Ashley from informal briefings, assigning her to solo duties whenever possible, and creating documentation that would support a transfer recommendation based on poor team integration. Ashley stared at Williams's phone, hardly believing what she'd just heard. Garrison had essentially confessed to retaliating against a protected whistleblower, and he died in front of multiple witnesses. "Why are you showing me this?" she asked quietly. Williams met her eyes. "Because what he's doing is wrong, and because you saved Rodriguez's life with those new medical supplies. He went down hard during the Desert Nav yesterday heat stroke, not just exhaustion. If we'd still had the old 4 fluids, he didn't need to finish." They both knew that crystallized 4 fluid could have killed Rodriguez. "Williams, do you understand what this recording means?" He nodded grimly. "It means we have proof that the commander is breaking federal law. Question is, what are we going to do about it?" Ashley looked at the phone in Williams's hand and realized she was holding evidence that could end Garrison's career and probably send him to prison. She also realized that using it would require her to declare total war against her commanding officer, with no guarantee of how the battle would end. "I need to think about this," she said finally. "Doc, he's planning to destroy your career. You think thinking about it is going to change that?" Ashley knew Williams was right, but she also knew that once she escalated this to the level of formal charges, there would be no going back. Either Garrison would be destroyed, or she would be. Military justice didn't leave much room for middle ground. That night, Ashley sat alone in her quarters with Williams's recording and her own documentation spread across her small desk. She had enough evidence to trigger an investigation that would almost certainly result in Garrison's court-martial. She had legal protections that should shield her from retaliation. She had the moral authority that comes from being right about something important. But she also knew that military justice, like all justice, was administered by human beings with their own biases and loyalties. There was no guarantee that being legally right would translate to career survival. Ashley thought about her father, about the principles he taught her, about the oath she'd taken when she enlisted. She thought about Rodriguez, who was alive because she'd refused to accept inadequate medical protocols. She thought about future soldiers who might die because commanders like Garrison were allowed to retaliate against people who tried to save lives. Finally, she thought about the Barrett rifle sitting in its case across the compound, and the warning Garrison had given her about touching it. She'd been told to stay in her lane, to accept limitations, to remember her place. But her place, Ashley realized, wasn't defined by other people's expectations. It was defined by her willingness to do what was right when the stakes were high enough to matter. She opened her laptop and began typing a formal complaint to the Inspector General's office, alleging retaliation against a protected whistleblower and requesting a full investigation into command practices at Camp Roberts. As she wrote, Ashley felt something she hadn't experienced since her father's death. Absolute certainty that she was doing exactly what she was supposed to do, regardless of the consequences. The war Garrison thought he was winning was about to become a battle he couldn't survive. The Inspector General's investigation team arrived at Camp Roberts on a Tuesday morning with the kind of quiet efficiency that made career officers break into cold sweats. Ashley first learned about their presence when she reported for morning duty and found the medical station cordoned off with investigation tape. A woman in civilian clothes with the bearing of a career military investigator was photographing Ashley's duty roster, while two men in dress blues were examining the medical supply inventory. Petty Officer Martinez? The woman looked up from her camera. I'm Agent Patricia Vance, Criminal Investigation Command. We need to speak with you. The next 6 hours were unlike anything Ashley had experienced in her military career. The investigators were thorough, professional, and relentless in their pursuit of documentation. They wanted every email, every duty assignment, every conversation that might be relevant to her complaint. But it was the afternoon session that revealed just how extensive their investigation had become. We've interviewed 12 members of your unit, Agent Vance informed Ashley as they sat in a temporary office set up in the base conference room. We've also subpoenaed all official communications from Commander Garrison for the past 6 months. Ashley felt a mix of vindication and terror. This was no longer about her individual complaint. This was a full criminal investigation into command practices at Camp Roberts. What we've found, Agent Vance continued, is a pattern of retaliatory behavior that extends beyond your case. You're the third service member to file complaints about Commander Garrison in the past 2 years. The previous 2 were transferred before their complaints could be fully investigated. The revelation hit Ashley like a physical blow. She wasn't Garrison's first target. She was just the first one with enough evidence and stubbornness to force a full investigation. However, Agent Vance's expression grew serious. Commander Garrison has filed counter-allegations against you. He's claiming that you've been insubordinate, that you've mishandled classified materials, and that you've made unauthorized use of weapons during training exercises. Ashley's blood ran cold. Those allegations are false. We believe they are. But they demonstrate that Commander Garrison is prepared to escalate this conflict significantly. Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny? Before Ashley could answer, there was a knock on the conference room door. Agent Vance opened it to reveal Williams, looking nervous but determined. "Ma'am, you asked me to come in if I remembered anything else about the medical supply situation." Agent Vance nodded and gestured for him to sit down. "What do you have for us, Corporal?" Williams glanced at Ashley, then back at the investigator. "I have something I think you need to see." He pulled out his phone and played the recording he'd made of Garrison's retaliation planning session. As Garrison's voice filled the conference room, detailing his plans to isolate and punish Ashley, Agent Vance's expression shifted from professional interest to something approaching amazement. "Corporal Williams, do you understand what you just provided us?" "Yes, ma'am. Evidence that the commander knowingly violated federal whistleblower protection laws." Agent Vance turned to Ashley. "With this recording, we have sufficient evidence for criminal charges. Are you prepared to testify at a court-martial?" Ashley thought about all the warnings she'd received about staying in her lane, all the attempts to diminish her contributions, all the threats about what would happen if she touched that Barrett rifle. She thought about Rodriguez, alive, because of medical protocols Garrison had tried to suppress. She thought about future soldiers whose lives might depend on people being willing to speak truth to power. "Yes, ma'am. I'm prepared to testify." The formal confrontation came 3 days later in the base commander's office, with more brass present than Ashley had ever seen in one room. Colonel James Harrison, the base commander, sat behind his desk flanked by the investigating officers. Garrison sat at a small table with his military defense counsel, his face a mask of controlled fury. Ashley sat across from them, feeling like she was about to witness the collision of two incompatible versions of military justice. "Commander Garrison," Colonel Harrison began, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, "you stand accused of retaliating against a service member who filed a legitimate safety complaint, violating federal whistleblower protection statutes and conduct unbecoming an officer. How do you respond to these charges?" Garrison stood, his bearing still commanding despite the circumstances. "Sir, I categorically deny these allegations. Petty Officer Martinez has been a problematic member of this unit since her arrival. Her complaint about medical supplies was merely the latest in a series of attempts to undermine unit cohesion and military discipline." Agent Vance stood and addressed the colonel. "Sir, with permission, we'd like to present evidence that contradicts Commander Garrison's characterization." For the next hour, Ashley watched as her case was methodically presented. The investigators had done their work thoroughly, documented patterns of retaliation, witness testimony from multiple team members, communications that revealed Garrison's intent to remove Ashley regardless of her performance, and the damning recording that proved deliberate violation of federal law. But it was Williams's testimony that provided the most devastating evidence. "Sir," Williams said, addressing Colonel Harrison directly, "Commander Garrison ordered us to exclude Petty Officer Martinez from informal briefings, to assign her punitive duty schedules, and to document any behavior that could be used to support her transfer. He explicitly stated that this was punishment for her medical supply report." Garrison's defense counsel objected, arguing that normal personnel management wasn't retaliation, but the recording made those objections meaningless. Garrison's own words proved intent to punish Ashley for protected activity. When the evidence presentation concluded, Colonel Harrison turned to Garrison. "Commander, do you wish to make a statement?" Garrison stood, and for a moment, Ashley saw something in his expression that looked like genuine bewilderment. "Sir, everything I did was in the interest of maintaining unit discipline and readiness. Petty Officer Martinez repeatedly challenged command decisions, went around the chain of command, and demonstrated a pattern of believing that military regulations didn't apply to her. I was trying to protect this unit from the corrosive effects of that attitude." Colonel Harrison studied Garrison for a long moment. "Commander, Explaining your motivations doesn't change the fact that your actions violated federal law. The evidence clearly shows that you retaliated against a service member for filing a legitimate safety complaint. He turned to the investigation. Team, what are your recommendations? Agent Vance consulted her notes. Sir, we recommend court-martial proceedings on charges of retaliation against a whistleblower, conduct unbecoming an officer, and violation of good order and discipline. We also recommend immediate relief from command pending trial. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Ashley watched Garrison's face as he realized that his military career was ending, not in honor or recognition, but in disgrace and legal jeopardy. Colonel Harrison nodded grimly. Commander Garrison, you are hereby relieved of command effective immediately. You will be restricted to quarters pending formal charges. As military police escorted Garrison from the room, he stopped beside Ashley's chair. For a moment, she thought he might apologize, or at least acknowledge that she'd been trying to do the right thing. Instead, he leaned down and whispered, "You have no idea what you just destroyed." Then he was gone, and Ashley was left sitting in a room full of senior officers who were looking at her with expressions ranging from respect to concern. Colonel Harrison addressed her directly. Petty Officer Martinez, you've shown considerable courage in pursuing this matter. However, I hope you understand that this unit will need significant rebuilding after this incident. Ashley stood and came to attention. Sir, I only wanted to ensure the safety and readiness of our medical protocols. I believe that, but intentions and consequences aren't always aligned. Harrison's expression softened slightly. You'll be staying with this unit through the court-martial proceedings. After that, we'll discuss your next assignment. As Ashley left the meeting, she realized that she'd won a victory that felt remarkably hollow. Garrison was finished. Justice had been served, and future service members would be protected from similar retaliation. But she'd also destroyed the command structure of her unit and made herself a symbol of what happened when junior personnel challenged senior officers. The Barrett rifle still sat in its case across the compound, but now Ashley understood that touching it had never been the real test. The test had been whether she was willing to do what was right when the cost was higher than she'd ever imagined. She'd passed that test, but she wasn't sure yet what she'd won. 6 months after Commander Garrison's court-martial conviction, Ashley Martinez stood on a hilltop overlooking the Pacific Ocean, wearing the crisp dress blues of a newly promoted hospital corpsman first class. The ceremony at Naval Medical Center San Diego had been small but meaningful. Her mother had flown in from 29 Palms, tears in her eyes as she watched Ashley receive the Navy and Marine Corps' Commendation Medal for exceptional courage in identifying critical safety deficiencies and pursuing corrective action despite significant personal risk. The official citation didn't mention the retaliation, the investigation, or the court-martial that had ended Garrison's career. It simply acknowledged that her actions had prevented potential casualties and improved medical readiness across multiple commands. But Ashley knew the real story, and more importantly, she'd learned to live with the complex emotions that came with winning a battle that had cost so much. The aftermath of Garrison's removal had been difficult for everyone at Camp Roberts. The unit had been disbanded and reorganized, with team members scattered to different assignments. Some had supported Ashley throughout the investigation. Others had viewed her as the person who destroyed their team cohesion. Williams had been assigned to a deployment in the Pacific, but he'd stayed in touch, occasionally sending messages that reminded Ashley she'd done the right thing. The court-martial itself had been swift and decisive. Faced with overwhelming evidence of retaliation and federal law violations, Garrison had eventually pled guilty to reduced charges. He'd been sentenced to dismissal from service, forfeiture of pay, and 6 months in military prison. More importantly, His conviction had triggered a command-wide review of leadership practices that resulted in policy changes, protecting service members who reported safety concerns. Ashley's new assignment at the medical center was everything. Garrison's threats had suggested it wouldn't be. Challenging, respected, and focused on the kind of advanced trauma medicine that utilized all of her skills. She worked with a team that valued her expertise and encouraged her contribute beyond the narrow confines of traditional medic roles. But it was the letter she'd received 3 weeks ago that had brought her to this hilltop on this particular evening. Ashley, it read, in Williams's careful handwriting, thought you should know that the new medical protocols you developed are being implemented across all special operations units. Word is that they've already prevented casualties in at least 3 situations where the old supplies would have failed. Rodriguez wanted me to tell you that he owes you his life, and he's not the only one. The letter continued with updates about former team members and their new assignments. But it was the final paragraph that had prompted Ashley's reflection. I know what happened at camp. Roberts was hard on everyone, including you. But I wanted you to know that a lot of us understand what you sacrificed to do the right thing. You didn't just save lives with those medical protocols. You showed us that doing what's right matters more than doing what's easy. That's a lesson that's going to stick with people for a long time. Ashley folded the letter and put it back in her pocket, then looked out at the ocean where the setting sun was painting the water in shades of gold and crimson. She thought about her father, who taught her to aim true even when the target was difficult to see. She thought about the promise she'd made to her mother about avoiding guns and violence, and how she'd learned that sometimes the most important battles weren't fought with weapons at all. Most of all, she thought about the lesson that had emerged from the wreckage of her confrontation with Garrison. That courage wasn't about being unafraid, but about doing what needed to be done despite the fear. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her new commanding officer. Martinez, we have a new protocol development project that could use your expertise. Interested in leading a team to redesign trauma care for Arctic conditions? Ashley smiled as she typed her response. Yes, sir. When do we start? As she walked back toward the medical center, Ashley passed a training range where new corpsmen were learning basic marksmanship. The sound of rifle fire carried across the evening air, and for a moment, she was transported back to that dusty range outside 29 Palms, where her father had taught her to breathe steadily and aim true. She'd never touched that Barrett rifle at Camp Roberts. The confrontation with Garrison had made it irrelevant. She'd found a different way to prove that she belonged, a different way to serve with honor, and a different kind of courage than the one she'd originally thought she needed. But Ashley had also learned something important about herself. She was capable of more than anyone had expected, including herself. She could identify problems that others missed, stand up to authority when necessary, and accept the consequences of doing what was right, even when those consequences were painful. The woman who'd arrived at Camp Roberts had been competent and dedicated but uncertain of her place in the military hierarchy. The woman walking back from this hilltop knew exactly who she was, a protector, a healer, and someone who would never again accept limitations that put lives at risk. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Ashley thought about the future with a sense of anticipation she hadn't felt since before her father's death. There would be new challenges, new protocols to develop, new battles to fight for the safety and readiness of the people she served alongside. And she would face those challenges with the knowledge that sometimes the most important victories came not from touching the weapons others thought you couldn't handle, but from finding the courage to handle responsibilities others thought you couldn't bear. The Barrett rifle had been a symbol of what she was forbidden to touch. But the real test had been whether she was willing to touch something far more dangerous, the truth that needed to be spoken regardless of the cost. Ashley had passed that test, and in doing so, She discovered that her father's lessons about aiming true applied to more than marksmanship. They applied to everything that mattered, everything worth fighting for, and everything worth the price of being brave, when bravery was the only option left. The war was over. The battle had been won, and Ashley Martinez, Hospital Corpsman First Class, was finally exactly where she belonged. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.